Okay, cats, you're being herded. Oh, I shall. I'm about to get to that. I hate to go. I really hate to use purpose, but you know. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hello, friends and clergy. Good luck. Actually. Hello, cats. You're being herded. We're going to kill the lights here in a moment. Come have a seat, please. If you don't have a seat, I'm going to start singing, and nobody wants that.
I'm either at work or in a meeting.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, it is good to be with you. For those of you whom I have not had the pleasure of meeting in person, my name is Adam Dawkins. I'm the curate here at Christ Church Cathedral, and it is my pleasure and honor to welcome each of you here today. It is also my distinct honor to introduce a gentleman whom I have known since I was a toffee-nosed 20-something, who had an idea of one day possibly going into the ordained ministry, and who has inspired me for more years than he knows. Bishop J. Neil Alexander is the Dean, Professor of Liturgy, and Quintard Professor of Theology Emeritus at the School of Theology at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, United States, my proud alma mater, if I may say. From 2001 to 2012, he was the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, and prior to serving as Bishop of Atlanta, he was Professor of Divinity in the School of Theology at the University of the South, and the Trinity Church Professor of Liturgics and Preaching at the General Theological Seminary in New York City, and has taught at Wilfrid Laurier and Yale, Drew, and Emory universities. He's the author of numerous publications in the fields of liturgy and sacramental theology and homiletics and pastoral theology, and much to his great pleasure, I'm sure, the 80th General Convention of the Episcopal Church appointed him to be the custodian of the Book of Common Prayer, a role that I know that he finds most gratifying. So, without further ado, I give you Bishop Alexander.
Here we see if I can get this thing on here. I think it goes. What? Oh, no. How does this thing work? Come here, Chris. Put this on me. That's what deans are for, among other many good things. Here, put that on. Okay. Well, thank you, Adam, for your kind introduction. And I will say to the folks here at Christ Church Cathedral and in the diocese, I take all the credit for the things he does well and none of the blame. and so forth. And I also, at the dean's clear instructions, I am to talk for absolutely a maximum of 30 minutes. And so I'm going to even set my stopwatch here. And I grew up in a tradition where on New Year's Eve, the preacher started preaching somewhere shortly before midnight. And then when the clock of the tower church clock struck midnight, if the preacher was in mid-sentence, we all stood up, the organ started, and we sang, "Now Thank We All Our God," and went home. And so the preacher always had to make his point in the first few minutes, because once the organ started, that was it. So I'm not sure, I've got so much material here, I'm not sure we're going to get it through it in 30 minutes, but we're going to try. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be back in Canada. I have wonderful memories of my time teaching at Laurier and working with the churches in Canada and whatever. And I try to continue to support the Canadian economy, because pretty much every summer I come back to Canada for my holiday, somewhere between here and Prince Edward Island, and that's always a particular joy, and it's great to keep up with my circle of friends in Canada. When the idea of me having something to say to you came up today, we originally thought about something that would have to do with sort of the stress points in the liturgical life of the church when things out there in the world that are not in the room, but they are very much in the room because they're out there in the world, and that's the place in which we live, how that might affect things. But those who invited me made perhaps the cardinal mistake of asking me to give a talk, not give a lecture. See, lectures are really tightly driven and tightly organized, and they have footnotes and all those other kinds of things, and it just makes perfect sense, and it's all wrapped up in a nice little package. A talk is just blather. Well, I'm going to blather for a few minutes about a few things close to my heart. And as I was talking about this, thinking about this notion of social stress and whatever, that immediately led me to recall some of the things that I have learned over the years and that my mentors have taught me simply about stress and managing stress and that sort of thing. And one of the things that saved my ministry, if I may put it so boldly, is when I learned from a mentor of mine that a significant part of what it means to be a leader is to work vigilantly about keeping the anxiety in the system as low as possible, so that the people in the system can thrive. And so that led me to say, okay, morning prayer, second cup, and then take a few minutes and say, all right, what am I going to do today as the leader of this community, as the leader of this parish, as the dean of this seminary, as the bishop of this diocese, whatever it was at the particular time, what am I going to do today to contribute to lowering the anxiety in the system so that people can thrive? And what I learned about that is when you lower the anxiety in the system, or at least make efforts in that direction, a lot of the things that you think are problems, and it's not that they're not problems, they are problems in many cases, they're real problems, but the solutions will come quicker and more healthily and helpfully if the system's anxiety is lower. People can actually talk to each other, people can hear each other in a way they can't when the system is high. I'm sure that Bishop John will probably have his own examples of this, but I remember the time I met with a particular parish, and having been their bishop for a while, I knew that this was a particularly high anxiety parish. They were always an anxious bunch. And it came time to call a new rector, and they called the most anxious priest I've ever met. Or at least they tried to call them. And I went and met with them, and I said, this is a good priest, a faithful priest, a godly priest. I support his ministry, and I'm not against this priest in the least a bit, but the combination of him and you folks, it's like lighting dynamite or something. because there was no way we were going to lower the anxiety. Anyway, that's one piece. So what are we doing? And you say, what does that got to do with the liturgy? Well, when you think about it, the liturgical life of the church can be a pretty high-stress environment. But when the clerk, I remember used to be, I walk into a sacristy and the bishop's here, oh my God, and everybody be so anxious. I just say, people, relax. We've all done church before. We've all done it in this room before. And in an hour, no matter what happens, there'll be coffee hour. And we will have had a little word of God, some prayers, and Holy Communion. So relax. Yeah? Okay, so that's one side of it. It has a lot to do with the liturgy at the end of the day. The next thing, though, is I find it myself a little anxious always. I'm not one of those people that kind of read books on how to be a successful president of a Fortune 500 company or how to be the world's best community organizer or how to use organizational development to grow churches. My experience is you apply that sort of stuff, it generally makes the churches smaller, not bigger, but that's my own bias. Nonetheless, what I find interesting is that there occasionally comes something down that pike that while they never use the word God, they never use theology, there's never a biblical reference, they have created a construct that actually can be very helpful to us. And one of the ones that is true for me there, I don't know whether the clergy here in particular have had an opportunity to read this. This is not a brand new book, it's probably 10 years old or something. But John Cotter, who is a longtime professor at Harvard, wrote a book called Leading Change. And he basically, it's 8 points. And of that kind of literature, you can take each of the 8 points, and if you scratch your head for a couple of minutes, there's a biblical story, a parable, a healing, a miracle, or something that aligns with each of the 8 points. And it's a wonderful model for it. But what's his number one point? His number one point is, if things are going to change, you have to create a controlled sense of urgency. Controlled is perhaps as important as the word urgency, which relates to how you lay that next to lowering the anxiety. If you create a sense of urgency, I thought, if you create a sense of urgency in a system that is already anxious, we call that terrorism. However, if you create an appropriate controlled sense of urgency in a healthy system that has a relatively low level of anxiety, what does it engender? Creativity and new ideas to get things done in a fresh and a new and exciting way. And so, I'm only going to recommend 2 resources today, I think, but that's one of them. It's a great read, and again, there's not a word of theology in it. But anybody who's a student of the Bible or a theologian or a pastor or a faithful layperson that thinks about their faith can read Cotter and go, oh, yeah, that's what Jesus was talking about in the parable of the, And so anyway, that's kind of where all that is. All right, pressing forward. Now let me check my clock here. Okay, we're good. All right. So that's where that is. Okay, there's another one. That has really kind of helped me. And again, you may be saying, what's this got to do with the liturgy? Believe me, I'll get there. But I don't know whether any of you know the work of this fellow. His name is Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. Simon Sinek. And again, he's not a theologian. I'm not even sure how he would describe himself. Motivational speaker, maybe, I don't know, a business person, a world rethinker, something, I don't know, whatever, something that I'm not. Anyway, but I found the most intriguing thing that he wrote a few years ago. He wrote a book that's called, I think it's called Get to the Why, and that's W-H-Y, not the gym, but get to the why. And it was a very revelatory book to me in terms of the life of the church. and how it relates to sort of all this business about living and being faithful Christians during times of stress, and how do we change the world in which we live, and how do we advocate for better places. You know, he really helps you understand that there are basically three approaches. One is the what, one is the how, and one is the why, and that we are really good at the what. I mean, you sit with your vestry, or you sit with fellow Christians, or you sit with your neighborhood, or whatever it is, and you sit there and go, well, what are we going to do about this problem? Whether it's homelessness, or whether it's this, or whatever the problem is, what are we going to do about it? Well, we can come to what pretty quickly, is his point. I mean, you don't take a bunch of rocket scientists to figure out the what most of the time, okay? But, and he says, and then you put a bunch of reasonably healthy, engaged people around a table and tell them what the what is, they can come up with the how pretty quickly too. Well, we're going to have this kind of ministry or that kind of ministry. We're going to raise money for this, or we're going to, strangle the government until they do this, or whatever it is. The what and the how come pretty quickly. But the thing that he convinced me of is being able to articulate a compelling why, an inspiring why, a thoughtful, empowering why are we doing this, is a lot harder. And it's a lot harder to get people to agree on it, but whether it's the bishop's vision, or the prime minister's vision, or the premier's vision, or the mayor's vision, or the Sunday school superintendent's vision. Can they articulate that in a way that makes some really empowering, inspiring sense? And the example I want to give you for that just was, I'm not quite, I hate to say things are life-changing, because, breathing is life-changing. But one of the places that really struck me on that was in his explanation of this whole thing, getting to the, and his larger point is that if you function only in what and how, you might get some things done. You won't get as much done as you could, and it will be kind of flat. It might be functionally addressed, but it won't be addressed in a truly transformative way. And one of the examples that he gives, I grew up in the South during the Civil Rights era in the United States. You can probably tell that from my accent. I grew up, with the ministry of Dr. King, in dialogue with just who I was and where I was and what we did and all of that. It was just life-giving in its own way. And then Simon Sinek in his book says, we should all be grateful that on that hot August afternoon in 1963, when it was 100 degrees and almost 100% humidity on the Mall in Washington, the man stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he did not say, I have a plan. Because if he had said, I have a plan, the civil rights thing would have just fallen flat on its face. But the fact that he said, I had a dream, meant that he bypassed the what and bypassed the how and got to the why. And we have been figuring out the why with energy and commitment ever since. We haven't built the kingdom yet. We're not there yet. There's still all kinds of stuff to do. But we are still motivated and empowered and driven, because Dr. King did not have a plan. Dr. King had a why. And when you begin to see that difference and think, okay, in our neighborhood, in our parish, in our part of the diocese, in our province, whatever the particular context may be, what do we need to do? We need to feed people, or we need to make sure the schools are better, or we need to make sure this is safer, or we did that. The what's easy to come by. And in many cases, the how's not too hard. But what's going to be the vision of the why that will change people's hearts, minds, lives, and energies? And, well, there it is. So I hope that that may be of some use to contemplate. Now, the next piece of this, and we're getting ever so close to the liturgy here, we're moving in that direction, is I want to argue, friends, that we need to be careful with our language, which is to say that language makes a difference. Language makes a huge difference in how we function. And I always want to begin this conversation by saying we should take a hint from God about the creative power of speech. Because remember, God spoke all of this into being. It was by speech that things got declared to exist. Think about it. I can remember as a young priest, wet behind the ears, naive, and thought he knew a lot, and realized pretty quickly that if he'd shut up and let the lay people teach him, he'd know a whole lot more. One of the things that I really had to learn to engage was the fact that part of my responsibility, and I shared that with the leaders of the parish, lay and ordained, is we had to talk things into being. We just couldn't throw it out there and hope for the best or expect that it was obvious for everybody. We had to do the priestly equivalent of let there be light. And we had to go around and say, it is good. This is good. We had to talk it into being and then declare it good. Taking a hint from the Almighty, it seems to me. And so we had to kind of speak things into being. Think about that in relationships. One of my favorite ways of thinking about this is, think about, you find yourself attracted to this other person, and you don't quite know what to say, but somehow or another you got to speech this thing into existence, right? And so and so maybe the first declaration is, how do you feel about milkshakes? Or do you want to go to a movie, or you want to go to dinner? You kind of create this thing with speech, And then if you notice that critical moment in a relationship, where both parties are dancing because both have realized that the words "I love you" are radically going to alter this thing. It's going to alter it by going, oh my God, I'm out of here. I'm done. This has been fun. Movies and milkshakes are great, but I love you that's a bridge too far at this point. So I'm out of here. Or, oh, I thought you'd never say it, or what? Y'all have all been in that dance. Who's going to say it first? There's a whole series of videos on YouTube that are basically based on couples' relationships and the story of who got to say it first. Who was the one that put that on the table first? Well, it's but speech matters. You talk your relationships into a kind of existence, and that's true also as things. And think of the politicians. It doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a NDP or Green Party or whatever. When Canada has had a particular national crisis of some sort, the Prime Minister, whether it's Mr. Trudeau or somebody else, the Prime Minister has to be enormously careful about what comes out of his mouth, because that is going to set the stage for how people of whatever party, whatever persuasion, whatever station in life or whatever, it's going to set the stage for how they begin the interpretation of that crisis, and whether or not they are safe, whether or not this is survivable, what the implications for them are going to be. Now, that doesn't mean the Prime Minister has all those answers, but how the Prime Minister sets up the conversation will drive the national response at some level. Imperfect for sure, human for sure. Doesn't mean it's all going to work out perfectly, but that's how important. It's the same way. I know for a fact, because I've been there, Bishop John will sit behind his desk and scratch his head on many afternoons because he needs to say something to the diocese, and he's still searching for just the right way to say it. No, he's got the what. He's probably got the how, but he's searching for the why so that it'll really connect. We talk these things into reality. Now, remember, friends, that thing we learned in kindergarten, actions speak louder than words? One of the things that I think Christian theology challenges is that that's not altogether true. That doesn't mean that actions are not important. We don't want empty words. We don't want words that don't carry freight, that hurt, that don't do their job in appropriate ways, that words that are empty can often betray. In other words, a word that is not followed up by action can often be betrayal. But again, imagine relationships. I mean, I can be courteous, I can be loving, I can be supportive, I can be involved, I can be romantic, I can be helpful, I can do all of those things. But at some point, I've got to put my arms around, my spouse and look directly in the eye and say, I love you. I mean, all the action in the world still has to have speech put on it for the level of reality to really, Now, it's not that, you want to just walk around saying, I love you and never do anything about it. I'm not saying that actions are not important. But you just, if you run through the scripture, you run through the theological tradition and whatever, there's a intrinsic challenge all the way through that to actions speak louder than words. Words are always a part of the transaction. And it underscores again how important it is for us to be conscious of our language. Another way of putting that is language reorients the task before us. How you talk about something influences the outcome. I've always been a little haunted. When I was dean at Sewanee, we had a particularly good year enrollment-wise. And so I went to the budget meeting with the suits, we used to call them, the bean counters of the university. And I said, well, yeah, looking like we're going to have a really good enrollment, so the School of Theology will have, 18%, whatever the number was, 18% profit next year. Well, the room kind of fell silent, and the provost looked over his glasses, and he said, Mr. Dean, we're a church-related university. There's no such thing as profit. But I am very glad to know that the School of Theology will have excess revenue next year. Yeah, well, he made an incredible point there, because we were not in the profit business, but a little excess revenue makes certain things possible that otherwise wouldn't be. Now, how does this language thing relate to something like this? Is going to irritate some of the clergy, but that's okay. I'm leaving. But let's just give you a couple examples about how language transforms things. Nothing makes me, as a liturgy professor of 40 years, cringe more than when I hear a priest say the words, plan the liturgy. It makes me want to puke. Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one is the liturgy's given. We receive it. Now, there's some things to do. You got to pick the hymns, you got to pick the canticles, you got to pick the anthems, you got to decide which of the multitude lessons the RCL gave us for this week, which one you're going to actually preach on. I mean, it's not that decisions don't need to be made, but there's a sense in which we have received the worship life of the church. Now, and that doesn't mean we don't have, still need to get the liturgical leaders, the priests and the musicians and the acolyte wardens and, whatever else they are. We got to get those people together, But what we got to quit doing is planning, and what we got to think about it is preparing the liturgy. I can't tell you how many places I've been and observed where planning the liturgy means it all happens in a room down in the office quadrant. And it's really all about the bulletin. It's all about what numbers are we going to put in the bulletin this week. But once that's determined, the preparation of the liturgy stops. And very little thought is then given to who's handling what and when and where and whatever. Or there may be kind of a lick and a promise on that, but not a whole lot, And so, but my point is not to be difficult but simply to say, the language controls the mindset that you bring to the task. So when the team gets together, are we getting together to plan something which is received? Or are we getting together to, in a more active sense, prepare for what is a living, breathing, the liturgy is not a text. We have a text in the prayer book. We have a text in the bulletin. There are texts that go along with it. But the liturgy is a living, breathing, active thing that happens when we do it. So how we talk about it, if it's something that's vital and energetic and involves bodies and movement and song and whatever, when you talk about that in reference to planning, it falls flat. You got to talk about it in terms of preparation. By the way, for those of you in the room who are preachers, I make the same argument there. I understand whether you're a manuscript preacher or whether you have a few notes on the back of an envelope or whether you just have a couple of Post-it notes to guide your thinking at the desk until you get your sermon worked out in your head and you're going to preach without notes. Whatever it is, I know of no preacher for whom a pencil is not important at some point in the process. A pencil being euphemistic for your computer now, probably, but nonetheless, there's writing involved. If I could just get people to say, I'm going to close my door and say to the parish secretary, I'm going to close my door now and write my sermon. If I could just get them to say, I'm going to close my door now, and for the next hour, I'm going to prepare to preach. Now, I might actually do that by writing, but just to change the mindset. A sermon is an oral event, not a written one. And so if you squeeze it toward, I'm going to write my sermon, you're creating something different from what you're going to do. But that's different from using writing to prepare to be oral. Right? And I know it sounds a little silly, but just the shift in the language you use to describe what you're going to do when you shut the door will, in fact, make a difference on how you think about that. Now, back to the planning, preparation of liturgy, just to throw a little thing out there. I've had people push back on that and say, no. Planning and preparing are basically synonyms. It's the same thing. We don't need to worry about it. You're creating a distinction where there is no difference. To which my response is, the Eucharist is a meal, and at least in the families I know something about, there's a difference between planning the meal and preparing the meal. So therefore, there ought to be some similar distinction in our liturgical life. Anyway, see, how am I doing here? I got 2 minutes. Actually, I got 1 minute and 30 seconds. Okay. And I've got about 10 more points to make. So I'm actually going to skip down to one of these. No, I can't do that. I want to have some questions and response. I'd like to suggest that in times of stress, we need to stability of the liturgy. So how does the liturgy contribute to the larger sense of stress? Here are the two places where that essentially happens. It's in the preaching and in the intercessions. I think the big responsibility, a much bigger responsibility falls on the shoulder of our preachers than we generally allow, and I don't think we keep our clergy busy to where they don't really have the time that they need to prepare to preach, which is the time in the life of a congregation when they have contact with the most people. But there's also the task of preaching. There used to be, in a former time, a kind of a Venn diagram that said, how do you create social change? And there was, in the concentric, the Venn diagram, all the circles come together. And for a long time, we said that one of those circles were the preachers. And having grown up in the southern United States during civil rights, I can tell you it was the preachers. I mean, yes, there was the government, and there was the president, and there was the Congress, and there was the, NAACP, and there was the this. There are all kinds of circles that contributed to this movement. But one of those circles that intersected with the rest were the preachers. The preachers talked us and pushed us in that direction. And that's not just true of civil rights in the South. That's true of a lot of things. You go back to women's suffrage. Who bears a lot of responsibility for it? Not the whole story, but a big part of the story where the preachers talked us in that direction. I suspect, well, I don't suspect, I happen to know, that, and if you go back in Canadian history with First Nations people and the history of Canada, and there are just so many factors of that, what made some of that conversation move forward? The preachers. They preached us there. They speeched us there, right? So that's one place. And so if there's a time of social stress, I'm not sure it's helpful to change the prayers. To change the liturgical prayers. I remember after 9/11, I got all kinds of phone calls. Can we create a 9/11 liturgy? To which my response was, what the hell for? No, this is a point where we need to hold on to the prayers that have shaped us and framed us and held our hearts together and whatever. Now, we had to speak to 9/11. That's the preacher's responsibility. And in the intercessions, we need to pray about 9/11. And we need to pray about our enemies. We need to pray about our friends. We need to pray about all kinds of things. But this is not a time, so there are ways to speak to these realities in intercessions and preaching, but leave the integrity of the liturgy there to be a safe place where the rest of these things can take place, that they give us a sense of comfort and security and a place to hang on to and a place to, that will continue to mold and shape us even as these other things interrupt. Okay. Finally, I want to give you just one other tip and this applies to whether you're a preacher or not, though. I think I probably threw this in as a preacher. I don't know whether any of you know the work of Adam Grant. Again, I've never been a big fan of taking people who write at the Wharton School of Business and try to turn that into theology, because most of the time it frustrates the heck out of me. But Adam Grant has a book called Think Again. And the subtitle of his book, which I think is fabulous, is Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. The power of knowing what you don't know. And again, it's not a book on preaching. It's not a book on religious communication. But it is a book about how to look at something and what kind of questions and what kind of tools can we use to look at that we're looking at and think about it differently. What's the definition of insanity? To do the same thing over and over, but expect a different result. Well, he's trying to say to us, we need to think about some of these. And I have found it an enormously helpful book, even as a preacher, to look at something and go, okay, let me use some of these tools to think about that differently. Now, some days it doesn't work. Some days it's just like, no, that's not what Jesus meant. And I can wish that's what Jesus meant until Jesus comes. But it's not what Jesus meant, so I've just got to stick with that. But I found it an enormously helpful book. So if you haven't read any of Adam Grant, gone on YouTube or something and found some Adam Grant videos or whatever, I highly commend it. He can be a little pedantic at times, but so can most professors. That kind of goes with the turf. But I commend it to you. Just how do we rethink some of these things, shape them differently? Anyway, so the burden, friends, is on our preachers. The burden is on the intercessions. But what I hope you will take away from these conversations is how important it is. Oh, let me give you my final example. And I don't know whether this is quite as vigorous on the north side of the border as it is on the south side of the border. But there's almost an adage in American culture right now that says the family is gathering for the Thanksgiving feast. We don't talk about religion or politics. That's a real problem. Now, it's more comfortable if we don't talk about religion and politics. But we've got to talk about religion and politics, and we need to hear Uncle Henry, and we need to talk to Aunt Mary, and Uncle Bill needs to understand that he's not the only person at the table that disagrees with Uncle Henry. Because if Uncle Bill thinks that he's the only person here that thinks different from Uncle Henry, the way he's going to feel about his family is different. Yeah, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. But when we refuse to talk to one another and engage in conversation with one another, to speech each other into place, to declare each other into position. And I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm simply talking about we need to be able to talk to one another. And in closing, no, I'm not going to tell that story. That takes too long. Anyway, that was cruel, wasn't it? But anyway, I hope that's what you'll think about. If we just reframe the language we use around many of these things, and use words that invite a deeper engagement rather than limiting engagement, which is the way most of us talk, frankly. We plan when we should be preparing. It's something as simple as that changes the landscape of how we exist and how we interact with one another. Anyway, I hope that was helpful for a little Tuesday afternoon repast, and I can hang around if anybody wants to chat about anything, but I also know, particularly those of you who have Holy Week duties, need to probably be on your way across the bridge and on to the duties that are awaiting you. So thank you very much for being here. Yes.
I was wondering what the story was you were going to tell.
Oh yeah, okay. I can tell it right quick. The story it does kind of relate in my mind to the kind of stuff I was talking about. But Marion Hatchett, I don't know whether that name probably rings a little bit of a bell with the clergy. Wrote the commentary on the American Prayer Book and is a very prominent liturgics professor. My predecessor at Sewanee, a great friend and mentor. When he was the rector of St. Peter's Church in Charleston, back when Charleston was still among America's most segregated cities, he preached one Sunday a sermon on civil rights and integration and desegregation and blah, 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 the whole thing. And he got home, and sitting in the congregation as members of the parish were several local political leaders who were very much on the other side of that fence, trying to keep Charleston, the way it had been always, and et cetera. And so he gets home to the rectory, and his wife comes and says, so-and-so's on the phone, and it was one of these politicians. And so he goes, they said, Father Hatchett, you just got to come right now. This is very important. We have just absolutely got to talk to you. I said, all right. So he puts his jacket back on, and he goes to their house, and they lead him through their grand Charleston home to the back veranda and give him a Bloody Mary. And then they sit down, and they start pouring out this stuff. They said, our teenage daughter has gotten herself pregnant, and there's this problem, and there's that problem, and whatever. And so, he thinks about, okay, I got to be a pastor in this situation, help this family through this difficult season, and And so then they set up some further conversations in the week, and the whole thing. I mean, he was a pastor. And then when the conversation was over, he was walking back through the house, and he gets just to the front door to reach for the doorknob, and he unfortunately kind of giggled a bit under his breath. And they said, well, "What are you giggling about?" And he said, "Oh, nothing. I just thought of something, and it made my giggle box, whatever." And they said, No, tell us. We'd like to hear something happy." And he said, "Well, actually, what I was giggling about was that I thought that I preached this sermon this morning, and then I know that y'all feel a lot differently about that, so I figured you were calling me over here to just give me, the once-over about all this, and then I come over and it turns out to be a more intimate pastoral situation." And the man said, "Oh, Father, no, that's okay. I didn't agree with a word you said this morning, but we pay you to say things like that." There it is, So, anything else before we? Yes, sir.
We had a wonderful example of this about 25 years ago with the late Wilfred Sullivan, who was an assistant here. There was a terrible problem with the heating system. There was a lot of mumbling going on. And he stood up.
Christians, evidently. Yeah.
And he said, "Many are cold, but few are frozen."
Yeah. So, all right, friends, have a good and holy week, and may God bless you and keep you. And if we all hold on to each other long enough, we'll eventually get to Easter morning.